I, Connor Dixon, was planning a move to a new city, the one where my favorite cousin Jeremy lived, and to figure things out, I took a long weekend trip there. The original plan was to stay with Jeremy, but his wife's entire family decided they wanted to visit at the same time, so I was transferred to the Hilton Hotel. It wasn't difficult. One of the few problems I didn't have in my life was money. My main problem was the lack of decent female companionship. I seemed to be attracted to all inappropriate types of women, which usually resulted in either anger, frustration, misunderstanding, or heartbreak on my part. Since Jeremy didn't like spending too much time with his wife's family, he and I hung around idly while I looked for places to live and set up my law practice. My practice is such that I rarely have to meet with clients in person, so I can live and work anywhere I am a member of the state bar. Saturday night, Jeremy and I went to a party organized by one of his business partners, Tom Baring. The party was a typical party for people in their 30s, except that he had a large dance floor in his equipped basement that was frequently used. There were a few single ladies there, and I'm a decent dancer, and I like to dance. So I was very busy. There was one confusing thing, however. Tom's wife, Susan, seemed to be something between a maid and a quiet woman. She didn't seem to have much to talk to, and mostly worked making sure all the drinks were available. She also seemed to put up with a lot of crap from Tom, whom I immediately disliked. I noticed Susan primarily because she was wearing a nice dress, not fancy, just cute, while most of the other women were in jeans or shorts. Susan's face wouldn't launch 1,000 ships, and her clothed body wouldn't inspire a sculpture by Michelangelo or Da Vinci, but she was a more than decent-looking woman. The old phrase, "I wouldn't kick her out of bed," came to mind for some reason, embarrassing me as I didn't like to think of women that way, especially married women. Eventually, when there was a short break in my dance card, I noticed that Susan had gone to the kitchen for more appetizers. I was introduced to her when we got to the venue, and she said the only word I really heard her say all evening. "Hi." I followed her into the kitchen and said without startling her, "Susan, you seem to be working too hard and not enjoying yourself. Is there anything I can help you with? In case you don't remember from our brief acquaintance, my name is Connor." She looked not just into my eyes, but seemed to look into my soul. Her eyes were so dark they seemed almost black before she replied, "Thank you." She then began to wash the glasses in the sink and asked, "Can you wipe?" I grabbed a kitchen towel and started wiping. I tried to engage her in conversation, and while she answered questions, her answers were brief. Not unfriendly, just very brief. And her responses to statements were usually just nods or smiles, rarely words. After we washed all the glasses, I helped her put some more appetizers on plates and then carried half of the plates and glasses to the dance floor and bar. A little while later, I asked her to dance. She declined. "Tom doesn't like me to dance," was probably the longest sentence she'd uttered that evening. Too bad. I chuckled and led her to the dance floor. She was an athletic dancer and seemed to enjoy it, but at the beginning of our second dance, Tom walked up to her and ordered her to get him something. She shrugged and walked away. I was angry, and if he hadn't been the host and one of Jeremy's co-workers, I would have intervened. A short while later, I found Susan alone in the kitchen again. I turned her toward me and asked her, "Why do you let Tom treat you like this? You seem like a wonderful woman. You shouldn't let him treat you rudely." She smiled and simply replied, "It's complicated. Could you help me one more time?" I willingly performed one more task for her, and after that, she actually approached me. "Where are you staying?" she asked, for the first time starting a conversation not only with me, but with everyone I observed. "At the Hilton on Grand Street. How did you know I was just visiting?" "Jeremy introduced you," she smiled, then shocked me with another question. "Does your room have a view of the lake?" "Yes, it's a beautiful view. So it's an even number." "What floor?" "It's room 810. You must be familiar with the Hilton Hotel," I replied with a smile. She smiled back and then left to do some other business. As Jeremy and I were leaving, I said goodbye to Susan. Tom was drunk at that point and unlikely to remember what I'd said to him, so instead of thanking her, I just muttered, "You're an asshole." I think Susan heard me. At least I think that's what made her smile. Jeremy and I went to a local hangout, played a little pool, and then I headed to my hotel. I showered and was in just my underwear, getting ready to go to bed, when there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole, but all I could see was something that looked like a woman's hair. I opened the door and was shocked to see Susan. She was wearing a raincoat. Susan didn't say anything when I asked, "Hi, Susan, why are you here?" Instead, she unzipped her cloak, revealing a very nice naked body, much prettier than it looked when she was clothed, including some pretty impressive breasts, and when that took on its intended shock value, took the opportunity to just walk past me. By the time I closed the door and my wide-open mouth, though my eyes remained wide open, she was wearing nothing but high heels. She grabbed my neck, kissed me hot enough to set off the fire alarm, though thankfully that didn't happen, and ran one hand down my boxers. What happened was the strangest sexual experience of my life. As far as I can remember, not a word was spoken. There were lots of moans, shrieks, and excited exclamations, but no actual words. I hadn't had sex in 2 months, but I managed to keep myself from ending too soon. Susan was the most relaxed and energetic sexual partner I had ever had in my life, or even dreamed of. Eventually, we stopped moving, both of us completely devastated. We somehow disconnected our joining parts and, given the hour and intensity of our copulation, either fell asleep or passed out. I was in the twilight zone and didn't realize it when Susan apparently got up, put her cloak back on, and left. I felt cold lying on the bed. Finally, I crawled under the covers and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I was sure it was just a dream. The only thing that convinced me that it was real was that there was a note written in lipstick on the dressing table. On the note was a smiley face and one word: "Thank you." I struggled to remember if Susan had spoken at all the previous evening during our binge. I couldn't recall her uttering a single word, but if her actions were words, they could fill a book the size of Tolstoy's War and Peace. The next day, I was practically in a trance. Jeremy and I looked at a few houses and offices together, but I was actually far from it. He must have asked me half a dozen times, "What the hell is wrong with you, Connor?" I made some lame excuse about a hangover, despite the fact that I'd probably had a total of 2 beers the night before. In reality, however, I was hungover. A sex hangover. Returning home Monday morning, all I could think about was my sexual encounter with Silent Susan. Although I'd dated at least a dozen better-looking women than Susan, sex with her was light years better than any other sex I'd ever had. I should have been saddened and felt guilty for having sex with a married woman, something I had never done before and intellectually and morally despised. Instead, all I felt was arousal. For the next month, preparing to move, I was emotionally exhausted. Except when I was working or working out intensely, I was thinking about Susan. It took a month after my move before I pulled my head out of my ass and started looking for a sorority in my new city. I made it a rule to never pass by Susan's house or try to contact her. I really liked my new town. After about 3 months of being there, I was making even more money than before. The environment was invigorating, and I made several friends, both male and female. I had a few dates, but nothing that really tipped my boat. There was an almost 3-month date to my new home when I went to a party without a date at Jeremy's house. I was having a pretty good time when Tom and Susan walked through the door. When I saw Susan, my thoughts immediately went back to my heavenly experience in room 810 of the local Hilton Hotel. She looked exactly the same as she had at her party, although the dress was a different color and her hair more elaborate. I waited until Tom had a couple sips of hard liquor, and when Susan was standing alone off Jeremy's little dance floor, I approached her. "Hi, Susan," I smiled. "Hi, Connor," she replied with a smile as well. "Would you like to dance?" I asked, holding out my hand. She just nodded her head yes, smiled, and took my hand. We actually danced until we fell over. Susan was less stiff than she had been at her party because she didn't have to worry about keeping the appetizers and drinks fresh, and she was an even more energetic dancer than I remembered. After about 45 minutes of fast dancing in a row, when we were both sweating profusely, I said, "Let's take a break. What would you like to drink?" "A soda," was her reply. She stayed put until I brought her a glass, which made me smile broadly. "Does Tom ever bring you a drink?" I asked, sipping my beer. "I bring drinks to Tom," she replied. After some more conversation, during which she gave her typical brief answers to questions and mostly body language in response to statements, I grinned, noting, "You're not very talkative, are you?" She smiled broadly. "It's a dream for some men to not be around a talkative woman. I believe in actions, not words." We danced some more, and I took her around to talk to different people at the party. She seemed pleased to be included in the conversation, although she still didn't speak much. As the party started to wind down, she apologized and went to find Tom. I was about to leave when she came up to me and asked, "Can you help me with Tom?" He passed out. "Sure," I smiled. I found Tom passed out in a glider on Jeremy's porch. Since it didn't matter before, I never mentioned my size, but I'm big and trim enough to quite easily sling his roughly 80 pounds over my shoulder fireman style, walk to his car, and put him in the back seat. Being as verbose as I've ever heard from her, Susan asked, "Could you please follow me home and carry him into our house?" "No problem," I smiled. Getting a dead-drunk Tom out of the back seat was harder than getting him out of Jeremy's house party, but doable. "Where do you want to put him?" I asked Susan. "Please, in the master bedroom on the second floor," she announced, opening the doors for me on the way out. Once I had him on the bed, she and I walked out of the bedroom and closed the door. At this point, she pounced on me like a bitch in heat. After about 2 minutes of passionate kissing, she said, "Shower." I do believe the word shower was the only real word she uttered for the next 90 minutes, although she made a lot of noises, especially when I had her. After we slept together for the second time in what is sometimes called the face-to-face position, I was sitting on the bed in her guest room and she was looking at me. I was practically comatose. Eventually, we stopped having sex and lay next to each other, lazily fondling each other. After a delightful period of joyful stupor, she said, "Tom sometimes wakes up after a 2-hour nap. You should probably get going." That was the most I've ever heard her say since I met her. After I got dressed and we kissed goodbye, she said, "If you want me to stay at your house Wednesday night, give me your address." Since the sex this time was, it's almost impossible to believe, even better than the first time, I replied, 902 Chardonnay Court. After another quick kiss, I was out the door. I wasn't entirely sure if Susan would show up at my house on Wednesday, but to make a good impression if she did, I had my house professionally cleaned on Tuesday and put new sheets on my bed. When I pulled up to my house around 5:30 on Wednesday, Susan was standing on my front porch with a big smile on her face. As I approached her, she gave me a brief but passionate kiss. "I thought I'd order something Chinese with delivery after we had dessert," she grinned. Susan insisted on paying the delivery man for the food, and I delivered the refreshments. She confirmed my suspicions that she hadn't consumed alcohol. "I don't want to lose my head," was her excuse. I laughed to myself. What do you think, if not wild? Showing up in my hotel room to hook up and having sex in your house with your husband in the next room. After dinner, I invited her over to watch a Netflix movie so our meal would have a chance to digest. As usual, though, she didn't say much in response. It was obvious that she was content. She was very touching as we hugged during the movie. When the movie was over, she gave me another of her patented, passionate kisses and quickly undressed. After a shower, another sex session, even better than the previous ones, some bedtime talk. She again mostly answered questions briefly and used body language to respond to statements. We fell asleep in each other's arms. When I woke up, Susan wasn't beside me, but her clothes and small purse were still in my room, so I assumed she hadn't left. Besides, I was awakened by the smell of bacon cooking. When I walked into the kitchen, the bacon was frying on the stove. Susan took her eyes off the notebook she was writing something in and smiled. "I can make you an omelet," she said, straightening her naked body and kissing me again. "I'll help," I smiled, kissing her again. Naked, we made a cheese omelet together. I asked her a few innocuous questions with her typical short answers until I asked, "What were you writing in your notebook?" "I was just doing some enthalpy calculations for a modification to the advanced BWXT nuclear reactor I'm working on," she replied, while skillfully flipping our omelet using only her wrist. "What did you say?" I laughed. She repeated what she had just said. After the second time, I was just as puzzled. "Why would you do?" "Whatever you said you were doing," I asked as she moved the omelet from the pan to two different plates using a spatula. It's part of my job. I'm a nuclear engineer, she replied as if nothing had happened. At first I thought she was joking, but since I had no idea what enthalpy was, I had studied economics in college and assumed it was a physics term I may have heard in high school but didn't remember exactly, or what an advanced nuclear reactor BWXT was, I didn't laugh. Instead, I asked, "Where did you go to school?" After eating a few slices of bacon and half an omelet, she started to really talk, not just answer questions or respond to statements. By the time we were both done, I realized she was a freaking genius. Although she was only 27 years old, she had earned her doctorate in nuclear science and engineering from MIT and had been in the field for 6 years. In fact, once she started talking about her work, I don't think she stopped for 20 minutes while we finished breakfast, washed bacon and omelet trays together, and put our plates and utensils in the dishwasher. Finally, she concluded, "Well, that's what I do in a nutshell." Granted, I understood about 1/10 of what she said, but it was clear she was a fucking genius. Kissing her in the kitchen, I rhetorically asked, "So you're a genius?" "Actually, with your help, I'm becoming a genius at sex," she grinned back, and then insisted on one more time in bed before we both left for work. For the next 4 months, I usually met Susan twice a week for sex. She was always mostly silent unless we were somehow touching on the topics of nuclear fission or fusion, which I was reading about just to avoid being a complete ignoramus in her eyes, when she would turn into a chatterbox. The fact that Susan had me senseless twice a week made me a sexually happy guy, so I didn't have many other dates. Then, during one of her sleepovers at my house when Tom was out of town, I looked over at her sleeping after another amazing sexual encounter. I noticed a few bruises on some parts of her body and wondered if Tom had hurt her. I had my suspicions because when I asked her about Tom's physical treatment of her in the past, she never gave a real answer. I suddenly admitted to myself that I had feelings for her, and while I hated her husband more every time I saw him because of the way he treated her and what an asshole he was in general, I also came to the conclusion that I was also an asshole for having a married woman. That Monday night into Tuesday morning, I barely slept at all, mostly staring at the ceiling while cradling Susan in my arms, though of course we were still due for divine morning sex, but I decided I had to do something about it. Susan shocked the shit out of me at breakfast when she seemed to read my mind. "Don't you think you should invite me to live with you, Connor?" she asked. It was the longest sentence she'd ever uttered in front of me that wasn't about her work. "You're married," I replied. "You'll have to spare me that," was her quick reply, and then she kissed me and slipped out of the door. I spent all my free time on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday thinking about Susan. I tried to call her cell phone, but the call went to voicemail and she didn't call back. Thursday night, 3 men and 1 woman in suits came to my house unexpectedly. One guy, Arnold, introduced himself as Susan's boss. Another, Patrick, was from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Rockville, Maryland. The third guy, Agent Stoll, was an FBI agent. And the woman, Astrid, was a family law attorney. "We're here to talk about Susan Baring," Arnold said. "Can we come in?" "Of course," I replied, ushering them into my living room and offering them drinks, which they all declined. "Let me get straight to the point," said Arnold. "As you may know, Susan is a genius and very important to our project to design a nuclear reactor that avoids most of the problems of the existing BWR and PWR nuclear reactors. I was proud that from my conversations with Susan, I really knew what BWR and PWR were." "I do know that," I smiled. "Well, we need you to save Susan. Right now she's in Mercy Hospital. She was beaten by her husband," he continued. "What?" I exclaimed. "Apparently that's why I couldn't reach her. Since she's a Tier 1 federal contractor, we've arrested him and he won't be out on bail," Agent Stoll added. "Susan hired me to file for divorce, which I intend to do tomorrow," Astrid interjected. "I have the papers already prepared." "How can I help?" I asked. "Susan would like to stay with you while she recovers. My company will pay for help during the day if you take over at night." "She's not helpless, just broken," Arnold continued, "but she trusts almost no one. Except you." Then Arnold shocked the hell out of me. "I'm afraid my company is largely responsible for Susan's predicament. Susan had never had any sexual contact before she came to work for us, as she was very quiet and shy and had always been the youngest student in her class throughout her schooling. She was beginning to show signs of depression, and she was so valuable to us that we arranged for her to be cared for by Tom Baring. Apparently, the people who vouched for Tom, I didn't know him very well myself, either didn't really know him or didn't take Susan's interests to heart. I could actually see a tear in Arnold's eyes, and Patrick patted him on the back before he continued. Apparently, Susan only agreed to marry Tom because he was the first guy to show real interest in her and she was lonely. As you can see, things didn't work out with Tom, but she brightens up like a Christmas tree every time she talks about you. She says that your approach to sex is infinitely different from the way it was with Tom, the only man she's ever had sex with. And if you have any feelings for her, we ask that you take her in to see if a long-term arrangement with you will work. She says she's had more sex with you in the partial year she's known you than she's had in the entire 3+ years of her marriage to Tom. I have to admit, I was shocked. The enthusiasm and joy with which Susan was having sex made me assume that she was experienced. Now I was being told that she wasn't before we met, and that she had real feelings for me. While I was still trying to make sense of what Arnold had said, Patrick started to tell me how valuable Susan was to the nuclear community when I politely interrupted him. I don't need a publicity campaign, Patrick. Before you arrived, I was trying to come to some kind of decision about Susan. Break up with her because she's married, or try to convince her to get rid of that asshole Tom. The current circumstances are very close to forcing me to commit to her. I'll tell you what. I'm going to go visit her in the hospital right now, and after I talk to her, I'll call you, Arnold, to let you know my decision. Everyone around me was smiling. Do you mind if we take a look around your house to see where we could put a hospital bed for Susan and what facilities we need to set up for nursing? Astrid asked. No, go right ahead. I smiled, taking my car keys off the rack in the kitchen where I keep them. Just make sure the front door is locked when you leave. I shook hands with all 4 of them and then got in my car and drove to the hospital. Susan's private room was guarded by a policeman, but he quickly determined that I was allowed to see her, so I passed him without a problem. I was stunned by her condition. She had 2 black eyes and other marks on her face and neck. One leg was twisted, and one arm had a cast on it. Although her eyes were closed, they immediately opened when I lightly stroked her cheek. Even though it seemed like it hurt to do so, she smiled when she saw me. Do you only need me for sex, Connor? She asked, and her smile was replaced with concern. No, although sex with you is the best sex of my life. I love being around you, Susan. Maybe I'm even in love with you. I'm in love with you, Connor. You treat me much better than any man, including my male relatives. Besides, I was never very sensual before I met you. Now I think about having sex with you at least once an hour during the day. Will you let me live with you for a while? If in a couple months you don't want me around anymore, I'll leave without any hassle. That would be great. I grinned and kissed her very gently on the lips. Her smile lit up the room. We then continued our hour-long discussion about our life goals, our views on children, our backgrounds, and more. The almost silent Susan was no longer silent. Eventually, the nurse kicked me out, saying Susan needed some sleep. After my first visit to the hospital, things moved quickly. Susan was discharged 3 days later, into my care. She signed a document prepared by Astrid that made me more or less her guardian, I don't remember the legal terminology, until she got better, with access to her finances if I needed them, which I didn't. I ended up enjoying caring for Susan while she recovered. After about a week, her one leg no longer hurt, and the bruises had healed enough for us to have sex, provided we were careful. So that's what we did, as often as was humanly possible. Susan was completely outpatient for 3 weeks after she got to my house. We got rid of the hospital bed, fired the day nurses, and she went back to work part-time. We enjoyed almost constant body contact when we were together. One Saturday afternoon, 5 months after Susan had returned to normal, well, not the old normal when she hardly ever talked, but the post-hospital normal when she liked to chat with me, she plopped into my lap and said, Connor, we need to talk, and not as well as I'd like. I want to tell you that I'm a nymphomaniac. You're a nymphomaniac? I fake aghast. Bad Connor, she said, clapping me lightly on the shoulder. Bad boy? Okay, now listen, my divorce is next week and I want your kids. What are you going to do about it? I said, stroking my chin. Will I be able to have you with the same frequency if we get married? More often, because I won't hold back anymore, she grinned. God damn it, you mean you were holding back? I fake aghast again. I'm not sure I can do anymore. You'll learn, she grinned. Good. Will I still be able to sleep with you when you're pregnant? Probably even more so. I have a feeling that, unlike many pregnant women, my libido will probably increase. She grinned. So, in other words, you plan to torture me to an early death? I chuckled. Not to the grave, just to permanent euphoria. Okay, I said after a long pause. Let's get married. So I can throw away my birth control pills? On our anniversary, I grinned, here's what we did. We got married. On our 2-year anniversary, our first child was born. Our second was born just before our 4-year anniversary. Our third and last was born just before our 6-year anniversary. After that, Susan had her fallopian tubes tied. I wasn't getting any younger, and her constant sexual demands during pregnancy wore me down, but in a totally joyful way. Somewhere along the way, 2 dogs came along, and Susan received a $400,000 bonus when she completed the development of an advanced nuclear reactor. The demonstration reactor functioned even better than anyone else predicted, though not Susan. With 3 kids, 2 dogs, a husband who wants her every chance he gets, and a full-time, part-time job as a nuclear engineer, Susan was no longer quiet. She's a chatty cat.